The canyon held its breath at dusk. Tyen stood on the stone ridge where she stood every evening, 6 feet and 4 inches of muscle in silence against the dying light. The wind moved through her long black hair like fingers through water, patient and persistent, but she did not move. Below her the canyon walls glowed amber and rust, ancient stone carved by rivers that no longer ran. Somewhere in that maze of rock and shadow her people were preparing evening meals, tending fires, telling stories she would never hear because she was always here alone watching. She had stood in this exact spot for 3 years, 1,095 sunsets. She knew because she counted them, each one a small punishment she administered to herself with the precision of a woman who understood that pain could be measured, rationed, and controlled. 3 years ago, in this very place, she had failed to save her brother's life. The memory lived in her bones, in the scar tissue of her heart, in the way she held herself like a fortress that had never been breached because it had already fallen once from the inside. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Horses. Men. She turned her head slowly, tracking the sound of hooves on stone, the jingle of bits, the low voices that thought distance made them invisible. 6 riders moving through the canyon approach with the confidence of men who believed strength was measured in numbers and weapons. They believed wrong. Tyen descended from the ridge without hurry, her feet finding purchase on rock face that would have broken another person's neck. She moved like water, finding its path inevitable and unhurried, until she stood in the narrow pass where the canyon opened to the grassland beyond. The traditional Navajo dress she wore, deerskin and turquoise beading, contrasted with the knife at her belt and the way she carried herself like a weapon that had forgotten how to be anything else. The riders saw her and stopped. She watched recognition move across their faces, that particular blend of disbelief and unease that men wore when confronted with a woman who stood taller than all of them, broader in the shoulders than their strongest, and utterly unbothered by their presence. "Turn back," she said in English, that carried only the ghost of an accent, a language she had learned because knowing your enemy's tongue was the first rule of survival. "This passage is closed." The lead rider, a thick-necked man with a cavalry mustache and eyes that had seen too much whiskey and not enough consequences, laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "We don't take orders from squaws, even tall ones. We got business beyond this canyon." "No," Tyen said. "You don't." She did not reach for her knife. She did not need to. The first man who rode toward her thinking speed would compensate for stupidity, learned this when she caught his horse's bridle and used the animal's own momentum to unseat him. He hit the ground hard enough to rattle teeth, and his companions watched their confidence evaporate like water on hot stone. The next 2 came together, which showed tactical thinking, but poor judgment. Tyen moved between them like smoke, using their own bodies as obstacles against each other, and when they fell tangled and humiliated. She had learned long ago that fear worked better than violence, that men who returned to their settlements with stories of the tall Navajo woman who had defeated them without breaking a sweat would keep others away more effectively than corpses ever could. The remaining 3 riders looked at each other, then at her, then at the canyon passage they would not be crossing today. The thick-necked leader spat into the dust. "You think you're so strong? You're just a woman playing at being a man." Tyen regarded him with the flat, emotionless stare she had perfected over 3 years of being everyone's wall and no one's person. "I do not play," she said, "and I do not need to be a man to be stronger than you. I only need to be myself." They retreated, leaving their scattered supplies and their wounded pride, and Tyen watched them go with the same empty feelings she always had after these encounters. Victory without satisfaction, strength without purpose, protection that kept everyone safe, and her perpetually alone. She was gathering the abandoned supplies, testing the weight of a flour sack, when she felt eyes on her back. Not the retreating riders. Someone else. Someone who had been watching for at least 15 minutes, patient, and still in a way that marked him as different from the others. On the ridge above, barely visible in the failing light, sat a lone rider on a dark horse. She could not make out his features, but she could read his posture, the way he held himself in the saddle, with the easy balance of someone who had spent more time traveling than settled. Most men looked away when she met their gaze. She stared up at the ridge, a clear challenge, and waited for him to do what they all did. He did not look away. Something in her chest tightened with an emotion she could not name and did not want to examine. Irritation, perhaps, or recognition of something that disturbed the careful equilibrium she had built from guilt and isolation. The rider urged his horse down the slope, moving slowly, his hands visible and empty in a gesture she recognized from somewhere deep in her memory. Her grandmother had taught her that there were ways to approach without threatening, ways to show respect without showing weakness, and this man knew them. The realization unsettled her more than his refusal to flee. She did not reach for her knife, but her body shifted into the space between rest and readiness, a place she had lived for 3 years, always prepared for violence, even when she craved peace. He stopped 30 feet away, far enough to be respectful, close enough to speak without shouting. In the dying light she could see him more clearly now, dark hair catching the last rays of sun, a face that carried its own history of loss in the lines around his eyes, hands that rested easy on the saddle horn, but bore the calluses of someone who had worked for everything he had. "Passage closed," she called out, using the same words she had used 1,000 times before. "Can't do that," he replied, his voice carrying none of the bluster of the men she had just sent running. "I've got medicine needed in a settlement past the canyon. Children are sick." "Not my concern." "Figured you'd say that." He dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate and calm. "But I'm asking anyway, not looking for trouble." "Trouble found you when you came here." She moved closer, studying him with the intensity of someone reading a language most people could not see. His posture straight but not aggressive, his breathing steady despite her proximity. The way his hand hung near his belt, close to the pistol there but not on it, a man aware of weapons but not eager to use them. "You're different from the others," she said finally, and it was not a compliment. "That makes you more dangerous or less. We'll see." She turned her back on him deliberately, an insult or a test, she was not sure which. Behind her she heard him shift his weight but not advance. "Not interested in fighting you," he said, and that made her stop. She turned back slowly, surprise crossing her features before suspicion replaced it like a door slamming shut. "Every man wants to prove himself against me." "I'm not every man." "Then what are you?" He met her eyes steadily, and she saw something there that she had not seen in 3 years. Not challenge, not desire, not fear. Just recognition, as if he were looking at another human being instead of a reputation or a threat. "Someone who knows there's more than one kind of strength," he said. The words hung between them, charged with something neither quite understood yet, and Tyen felt the ground shift beneath her assumptions about him. She had built her entire identity on being stronger than any man, on making sure no one could ever match her physically, and here stood someone who simply refused to play that game. "You don't get to pass because you have a clever tongue," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "Didn't think I would." He gestured to the scattered supplies the other riders had left. "But while we're talking, mind if I look at what those men left behind? Might be something useful." She watched him crouch near the abandoned packs, sorting through them with quick, efficient hands that knew the value of every item. When he pulled out a water skin and offered it to her first before drinking himself, something in her chest twisted uncomfortably. This man was going to be more complicated than she had thought. She was considering what that meant, standing in the gathering darkness with a stranger who looked at her like a person instead of a legend, when the scream cut through the evening air like a blade through cloth. Tyen was already running before conscious thought caught up with her body, her long legs covering ground with speed that should not have been possible for someone her size. Behind her she heard the stranger following his footsteps, quick and purposeful, and she did not have time to wonder why he was running toward danger instead of away from it. They found the source 60 yards into the canyon. 2 members of her tribe trapped beneath a partial rock slide, and Tyen's world narrowed to a single point of focus that had nothing to do with the stranger and everything to do with the 2 people who were dying while she stood there. The young man pinned from the waist down was Tawa, her cousin's son, barely 20 years old, with his whole life still ahead of him if she could keep him alive. The older woman with the twisted leg and the gray tinge to her lips was Nalnish, one of the tribe's weavers, grandmother to half the children in the camp. "Tawa," Tyen breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands moved over the rocks with frantic precision, testing weight and stability, her mind calculating angles and leverage, while her heart screamed at her to move faster. "Save them, don't fail again." "Don't move," she told him, her voice steady, despite the panic clawing at her throat. "Don't try to shift." "Hurts," he gasped. "Grandmother. Check grandmother." The stranger was already there, crouching beside Nalnish, with the same calm efficiency he had shown sorting through supplies. "She hit her head," he said, not to Tyen, but to the situation, speaking his assessment aloud. "The leg is bad, clearly broken, but what worries me more is the head injury. We need to move these rocks now, but carefully. Wrong move could bring down more." Tyen looked at him across the space between the trapped victims, and in that moment all pretense of antagonism evaporated. There was only the crisis, only the need, only two people who knew how to act when others would freeze. "You know medicine," she said. "Not a question. Field medicine. Enough. Then tell me how to move these rocks without killing them." He assessed the situation with quick calculation, and she recognized the look in his eyes, the same look she wore when fighting the absolute focus that came from knowing lives depended on precision. "The big one on the woman," he said. "We lift together on my count. You're stronger. You take the weight. I'll pull her clear. The boy is more complicated. Those rocks are supporting each other. We'll need to shore up the gaps before we remove them." "Shore up with what?" "Wood from my saddle pack, canvas, anything that can distribute the weight differently." He met her eyes. "But we have to move her first. That head injury won't wait." Tyen positioned herself at the heaviest boulder, and only then did she notice that her hands were shaking, barely, almost imperceptibly, but shaking nonetheless. This was not just tribe. This was family. Tawa was the son of the cousin who had taught her to track. Nalnish had woven the blanket Tyen slept under every night. "On three," the stranger said, gripping Nalnish's shoulders with gentle firmness. "1, 2, 3. Tyen lifted. The muscles in her arms and back bunched with effort, veins standing out against her skin, and the boulder shifted with a grinding sound that made them both freeze. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The world held its breath. Then the stranger pulled, dragging Nalnish free, just as Tyen's strength gave out, and the boulder crashed back down with force that would have crushed anything beneath it. They both sat hard in the dust, breathing heavy. Nalnish lay between them, alive but damaged in ways that would take time to measure. "Tawa," Tyen said, already moving toward her trapped cousin, but the stranger caught her arm. "We do this wrong, we kill him," he said, and she felt the coiled strength in his grip, the certainty in his voice. "We need the supplies from my pack. We need to think." "We don't have time to think. We have exactly enough time to do this right." He stood pulling her up with him, and she was surprised to find herself letting him. "He's stable for now, conscious, talking. That leg injury, we rush it, we cause bleeding, we can't stop. You know I'm right." She did know. She could see it in the way Tawa's color remained steady, in the pattern of his breathing, and the fact that the rocks had pinned him without crushing him. They had minutes, maybe an hour, and rushing would turn that time into a death sentence. "Get your supplies," she said, the words tasting like surrender. "Fast." They worked in the gathering darkness, and Tyen was struck by how easily they moved around each other, how she anticipated what he needed before he asked, how he understood where she should position herself for maximum leverage. It was like a dance they had practiced for years instead of improvised in minutes, and that unsettled her almost as much as the crisis itself. When they finally freed Tawa, his legs were crushed badly enough that Tyen knew the recovery would be long and uncertain. But he was alive, and that was something. She carried her cousin with a gentleness that contradicted everything about her fierce reputation, cradling him like the child he had been when she first learned to fight. The stranger supported Naelnish, moving slowly through the canyon toward the tribal camp, and it was only then that Tayan became aware of eyes in the darkness. Other tribe members watching, judging, measuring this outsider who moved among them. "They'll want you gone," she said quietly as they walked. "Once everyone is stable, they'll demand I send you away." "Will you?" She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried a weight of realization that changed the texture of the air between them. "I don't know anymore. You saved my family tonight. That creates a debt. I didn't do it for debt. I know." She adjusted Tawa's weight across her shoulders. "That's what makes it complicated." They reached the camp, a cluster of traditional hogans mixed with more permanent structures, all tucked into a protected fold of the canyon. People emerged from the shadows, concerned faces turning to shock when they saw the stranger. An older man stepped forward, his face carved with age and authority, his eyes sharp despite the years. This was Hastian the elder, who had raised her after her parents died, the man who knew all her secrets except the ones she kept from herself. "Tayan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of leadership and worry in equal measure. "What is this?" "This is the man who helped save Tawa and Naelnish." She hesitated, realizing she had never asked his name, had spent the last hour working beside him in life-or-death intimacy without knowing what to call him. "This is someone whose father was known to our people." The stranger spoke, then, his voice respectful but not subservient. "My name is Kalen Vance. My father was Captain William Vance. He served at Fort Defiance. And 3 years ago he tried to save a boy named Ashki." The silence that followed was absolute. Tayan felt the world tilt beneath her feet, felt 3 years of carefully constructed walls begin to crack. She stared at Kalen Vance, this man who had appeared like a ghost from her worst memory. This stranger who was not a stranger at all, but the son of the man who had failed to save her brother, who had watched Ashki die despite all his skill and desperate effort. "Your father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is dead." 2 years now," Callan replied, and there was grief in his voice, old and worn like a stone smoothed by water. "He took his own life. The guilt of not saving your brother consumed him." Around them the tribe members murmured in their language, and Tayan heard Ashki's name repeated like a prayer or a curse. Hastian's face had gone still the way it did when he was processing information that changed everything. "We don't allow outsiders here," Hastian said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "He's already here," Tayan heard herself say, her voice taking on an edge she recognized as defensive. "And Naelnish needs medical attention he knows how to give. We can discuss rules after we discuss survival." She watched the silent battle of wills between herself and Hastian, watched the way her tribe members shifted uneasily, caught between gratitude and distrust. She understood suddenly that Kalen's presence here was not just breaking her personal rules about men and strength. It was breaking something much bigger, the boundary she had spent years reinforcing between her people and the outside world that kept trying to destroy them. "One night," Hastian said finally, "you tend the wounded, then you leave before dawn. And you never speak of this place to anyone." "Agreed," Callan said before Tayan could complicate things. As they carried the injured into a structure lit with low firelight, as she showed him where to lay them down, and began gathering the herbs and supplies they would need. Tayan felt the weight of something enormous pressing down on her chest. This man was the son of the doctor who had failed to save Ashki. His presence here should have filled her with rage, with the need for vengeance, with all the emotions she had been nursing for 3 years, like bitter medicine. Instead, she felt only a terrible, aching curiosity about what it meant that he had come here, had helped her save her family, had worked beside her with the same desperate precision that his father must have used trying to save her brother. She glanced at him across the firelight as he knelt beside Naelnish, checking her pupils with gentle fingers, and felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Hope. And that terrified her more than any enemy ever could. The night stretched long and merciless. Tayan worked beside Callan in the firelit interior of the healing hogan, her hands moving through familiar motions, while her mind wrestled with impossible contradictions. This man, this stranger, who was not a stranger, mixed poultices with the competence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His fingers scarred and careful cleaned Nailnish's wounds with a gentleness that made Tyen's throat tight. She had spent 3 years imagining the family of the doctor who failed to save Ashki. In her darkest moments, she had pictured them living comfortable lives, unburdened by the weight of a Navajo boy's death, going about their days as if that failure had cost them nothing. She had never imagined this. A son who carried his father's guilt like stones in his pockets, who had ridden into the heart of Navajo territory knowing he might not leave alive, who worked through the night to save people he did not know, because saving them might somehow balance a scale that could never truly be balanced. "The head injury is stable," Callan said quietly, his voice low enough not to wake Nailnish. "But she needs to be monitored through the night. Someone should check her pupils every 2 hours, watch for any changes in her breathing." "I will do it," Tyen replied, mixing yarrow and sage into a paste her grandmother had taught her to make before she died, before everything had fallen apart. "Your cousin's legs," Callan continued, moving to where Tawa lay sleeping under the influence of the pain medicine they had given him. "The bones are set as well as I can manage, but infection is the real danger now. The next 3 days will tell us if he keeps them." Tyen looked up sharply. "He could lose his legs. He could lose his life if infection sets in." Callan met her eyes across the low fire, and she saw no attempt to soften the truth, no false comfort. Just honesty delivered with the weight of someone who had seen too many people die to believe in pretty lies. "But I've done everything I know how to do. The rest is up to his body and whatever gods you pray to." "I don't pray anymore." Tyen said the words, slipping out before she could stop them. "Neither do I." The admission hung between them, two people who had stopped believing in divine intervention because they had seen too much evidence of divine absence. Tyen returned to her work, grinding herbs with more force than necessary, and felt Callan's presence like heat on her skin, even though he had moved to the other side of the hogan. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, not looking up from her work. The truth this time, not the story about medicine for sick children. Silence. Long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then she heard him take a breath, the kind that came before difficult words. "There are sick children," he said. "That part is true, but it's not why I'm here, not really." Tyen's hands stilled. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not read, something between resignation and relief, as if he had been waiting for this question and dreading it in equal measure. 3 years ago, Callan said, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of pain that made Tyen's chest tighten. "My father came home from Fort Defiance a different man. He had always been stern duty-bound, the kind of soldier who believed orders were sacred and emotions were weakness. But after your brother died, something in him broke." He stood moving to the small window that looked out over the dark canyon, his back to her as he spoke. He stopped sleeping, started drinking, would wake up in the middle of the night screaming a name I didn't recognize until I finally forced him to tell me. "Ashki." He would scream Ashki's name like it was being torn from his throat. Tyen felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had spent 3 years hating the doctor who failed to save her brother, but she had never considered that the failure might have destroyed him too. 2 years ago. Callan continued, his reflection barely visible in the dark glass. "I came home from a supply run to find him in his study. He had written 2 letters. One was addressed to me. The other was addressed to someone named Hastian, but he never sent it. He just left it on his desk next to his service pistol." The words landed like stones in still water ripples spreading outward to touch everything. Tyen stood slowly, her body moving without conscious thought, drawn toward this man who was unraveling a story she had never known existed. "What did the letters say?" Callan turned to face her, and in the firelight she could see the tracks of old grief carved into his features like canyons worn by decades of water. "Mine said that he was sorry. Sorry for failing your brother. Sorry for failing me. Sorry for being too weak to carry the weight of what he had done." He pulled something from inside his shirt, a leather cord she had not noticed before. Hanging from it was half of an amulet, turquoise, wrapped in silver wire, the break clean as if it had been deliberately severed. He left this with the letter. Said it belonged to the family of the boy he couldn't save. Said I should find them and return it. Tyen's hand moved to her own throat, to the amulet she wore every day, the one she had found by the river 2 years ago and worn because something about it felt right, felt protective. With trembling fingers she pulled it free from beneath her dress. The 2 pieces matched perfectly. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was not impossible at all. Her grandmother had been a healer, had traveled to Fort Defiance years ago to help during a fever outbreak. She had saved Callan's mother, had been given an amulet in gratitude. And when Ashki was dying, when the doctor had fought desperately to save him, somehow the amulet had broken, one half staying with the doctor, the other half lost until Tyen found it 2 years later. "The letter to Hastine," Callan said, watching her press the 2 halves together, watching them fit like they had never been apart, said something else, something my father never had the courage to tell anyone while he was alive. "What?" Callan's jaw tightened, and Tyen saw him gather himself like a man preparing to jump from a great height. "It said that he was not the one who made the critical mistake that killed your brother. He took the blame, but the mistake was mine." The world tilted. Tyen heard the words, understood their meaning, but could not reconcile them with the man standing before her, the man who had just spent hours saving her family, the man who looked at her with eyes that held nothing but painful honesty. "You," she said the word, barely audible. "You killed my brother." I was 25, a medical assistant. I had been trained, but not enough, not for the kind of injury your brother had. There was a procedure, a blood transfusion, and I miscalculated. Just one small error, but it was enough. He did not look away from her, did not try to hide behind excuses or explanations. My father saw what I had done. He could have corrected me, could have told the truth. Instead, he took the blame, told everyone the decision had been his, and he carried that lie until it killed him. Tyen felt rage building in her chest, hot and familiar, the anger she had nursed for 3 years finding a new target. This man had killed her brother, had let his father take the blame, had lived while Ashki died and her family shattered and her entire world collapsed into grief and guilt. She could kill him, right now. Her hands could snap his neck before he could draw breath to scream. The tribe would support her, would call it justice, would understand. But as she stood there, muscles tensed for violence, she looked into Callan's eyes and saw something that stopped her cold. He was not afraid. He was not pleading. He was not trying to defend himself or run or fight back. He was simply standing there waiting like a man who had been waiting for 3 years for someone to deliver the punishment he believed he deserved. "Why are you telling me this?" Tyen asked, her voice shaking with the effort of not screaming. "Why come here? Why help my family? Why not just disappear and let the lie die with your father?" "Because I'm tired," Callan said simply. "Tired of running, tired of pretending, tired of letting innocent people pay for my mistakes. Your brother died because of me. My father died because of me. And I have spent 3 years trying to find a way to make that right, knowing that nothing I do will ever be enough." He pulled the letter from his pocket, the one addressed to Hastine, yellowed and worn from being carried for 2 years. This was supposed to explain everything. To ask for forgiveness that my father knew he would never receive. To tell your elder that the real killer was his son, and that he should be the one punished, not the memory of a broken doctor. Tyen stared at the letter like it was a snake. "And what did you think would happen? That you would deliver this letter and die a hero's death? That my people would kill you quickly, and you could finally stop feeling guilty?" "I thought," Callan said, and his voice cracked just slightly, "that maybe if I told the truth, if I faced what I had done, if I stopped running, then maybe I could figure out how to live with myself, or at least how to die with some small piece of honor intact." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the night sounds of the canyon continued indifferent to the small human drama unfolding in firelight and shadow. Tyen felt something inside her chest warring with itself, rage and grief tangling with something else, something she could not name. "I should kill you," she said. "Yes. I should take you to Hestian and let him decide your fate. Yes. I should tell my people what you have done and let them have their justice." "Yes," Callan said for the third time. "You should do all of those things. And I won't stop you. I came here knowing that truth has a price and I'm willing to pay it." Tyen moved toward him, using her height and strength to intimidate, stepping into his space until they stood close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could count the different shades of brown in his eyes, could smell the sage and smoke that clung to his clothes from hours of working beside her. "But you helped save Tawa and Naalnish," she said. "Why? If you came here to die, why bother saving anyone?" "Because I'm a doctor's son," Callan replied, not backing away, even though she loomed over him, even though her hands could end his life in seconds. "And no matter how much I want to die, I can't watch someone suffer without trying to help. It's the only thing my father taught me that I still believe in, that we save who we can even when we can't save everyone, especially then." Tyen felt tears burning behind her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She had not cried since the night Ashki died, had not allowed herself the weakness of grief, the luxury of tears. But standing here with the man who had killed her brother, the man who had also saved her family, she felt 3 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I don't know what to do with you," she whispered, and it was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 years. "Then do nothing tonight," Callan said. "Let me finish helping Tawa and Naalnish. Let me do the one thing I know how to do. Tomorrow when they're stable you can decide. You can tell Hastian. You can kill me yourself. You can let me go. Whatever you choose, I'll accept it." Before Tyen could respond, before she could untangle the impossible knot of emotions in her chest, footsteps sounded outside the hogan, quick and urgent. The door opened and a young man stumbled in, breathing hard, eyes wide with fear. "Tyen," he gasped. "Hastian, he's collapsed. He's not breathing right. We need help. We need medicine. Please." Tyen's world narrowed to a single point. Hastian, the man who had raised her after her parents died. The man who had taught her strength and pride and how to survive in a world that wanted to destroy her people. The only family she had left besides the tribe that feared her almost as much as they needed her. She turned to Callan and he was already moving, gathering supplies, his face set in lines of professional focus. "What are his symptoms?" Callan asked the messenger. "Chest pain, difficulty breathing. His lips are turning blue." "Heart," Callan said to Tyen. "He needs digitalis. It's a medicine made from foxglove. I don't have any with me, but they'll have it at Fort Defiance. It's the only thing that might save him." Tyen felt the universe closing in around her, all paths leading to the same impossible choice. Fort Defiance. The place she had sworn never to return to. The place where soldiers who had killed her people still walked free. The place where her brother had died while a doctor and his son failed to save him. "How long does he have?" she asked. "Hours. Maybe 8 if we're lucky. The fort is 30 miles from here. If you leave now, ride hard, you might make it back in time." Tyen looked at the messenger, at Callan, at the 2 halves of the amulet still clutched in her hand. Every choice she had made for 3 years had been about avoiding exactly this moment, this decision, this test of everything she claimed to believe. "I can't go alone," she said, the words tasting like ash. "They won't give medicine to a Navajo woman, not without questions, not without complications that will cost time we don't have." "Then I'll go," Callan offered immediately. "They won't believe you either. A stranger asking for medicine for a Navajo elder, they'll think it's a trap." The solution sat between them, obvious and terrible. "We go together," Callan said quietly. "I request the medicine as a former Army medic. You ensure I don't betray your people's location. It's the only way." Tyen wanted to refuse, wanted to find any other solution, but Hastian's life hung in the balance, and she had already lost too many people to pride and stubbornness and the belief that she could handle everything alone. "If this is a trick," she said to Kalin, her voice low and dangerous. "If you betray us to the fort, I will kill you slowly. I will make you beg for the quick death I could have given you tonight." "I understand," Kalin said, "and I give you my word. The only betrayal I've committed was 3 years ago. I won't compound it with another." Tyan made her decision in the space between heartbeats, knowing it would change everything, knowing there was no path back to the person she had been before this night. "We leave in 10 minutes, she said. "Gather what you need, and pray to whatever God you don't believe in that we make it in time." As she moved to prepare for the journey, as she strapped weapons to her body and steeled herself for the ride that would take her back to the place of her greatest loss, Tyan caught her reflection in a piece of polished metal hanging on the wall. She looked like a warrior preparing for battle, but inside she felt like a frightened girl about to walk back into the nightmare she had spent 3 years trying to escape. And the man who would walk beside her into that darkness was the son of her brother's killer, carrying secrets that could destroy them both. The night outside was cold and waiting, and somewhere in the distance death was measuring the hours until it could claim another person she loved, unless she could outride it one more time. The canyon swallowed them whole. Tyan rode ahead, her horse moving through darkness with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had traveled this path 100 times before. Behind her she could hear Kalin's mount picking its way more carefully over stones and through narrow passages where the walls pressed close enough to scrape boots against rock. She did not slow for him, did not look back. If he could not keep pace, he would be left behind, and that would solve at least one of her problems. But he kept pace. The first 10 miles passed in silence so complete it felt like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Tyan's mind raced while her body moved on instinct, guiding her horse through twists and turns that would have lost a stranger within minutes. She thought about Hastian lying in his hogan, his heart failing, his breath coming in shallow gasps while his body slowly shut down. She thought about Ashki bleeding out on a surgeon's table while a young doctor made a mistake that would ripple through years and lives like stones thrown into still water. She thought about her mother dead 20 years and the secrets Hastian had kept about that death, secrets she had only learned fragments of, whispers and half-truths that suggested her mother's end had been neither natural nor peaceful. She thought about the man riding behind her carrying guilt like a second skin and wondered what kind of strength it took to return to the place of your greatest failure to confess your worst sin to the people most likely to kill you for it. "We need to stop," Kalin called out when they reached a wider section of the canyon, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade through fabric. "Your horse is favoring its left foreleg." Tyan pulled up sharply, irritation flashing hot in her chest. "We don't have time to stop. We'll have even less time if your horse goes lame." Kalin dismounted, moving to her horse with the same calm efficiency he had shown in the healing hogan. His hands ran down the animal's leg, gentle but firm, and Tyan watched the way her horse, who tolerated no one else's touch but hers, stood quietly under his examination. "Small stone wedged in the hoof," Kalin said, already pulling a tool from his saddlebag. "Just needs to be removed. 2 minutes." Tyan dismounted, her body stiff from tension and the cold night air. She stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching Kalin work with the focused attention of someone who had done this task so many times it had become meditation. The stone came free with a soft click, and he checked the hoof carefully before straightening. "She'll be fine now," he said, patting the horse's neck. "Good animal. Well cared for." "She was my brother's," Tyan said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "He raised her from a foal. After he died, she wouldn't let anyone else ride her, except me." Kalin's hand stilled on the horse's neck. He did not turn around, did not offer empty sympathy, and Tyan was grateful for that. Sympathy would have made her angry. Silence somehow felt like respect. They remounted and continued riding, but something had shifted in the quality of the quiet between them. It was no longer the silence of enemies forced into unwilling alliance, but something else, something Tyan could not quite name and did not want to examine too closely. Mile 15 brought them out of the canyon and onto open ground where moonlight turned the desert into a landscape of silver and shadow. Here they could ride faster, and Tayan urged her horse into a ground-eating lope that covered distance but preserved strength. Kaelin matched her pace without complaint, and she found herself grudgingly impressed by his horsemanship, the way he moved with his mount instead of fighting it. It was at mile 18 that everything changed. Tayan felt at first a wave of dizziness that made the world tilt sideways. She gripped the saddle horn, blinking hard, trying to clear her vision. Her side burned where she had been injured earlier, the wound she had bandaged hastily before the rock slide, before Tawa and Nalnish, before this entire impossible night had begun. Tayan. Kaelin's voice came from very far away, even though he was riding right beside her. "You're bleeding." She looked down and saw the dark stains spreading across her side, black in the moonlight. The wound had reopened during the rockslide rescue, and she had been bleeding slowly for hours, adrenaline and sheer will keeping her upright until now. But will could only carry a body so far, and hers had reached its limit. "I'm fine," she said, but the words came out slurred. "You're going into shock." Kaelin was already dismounting, reaching up to catch her as she swayed in the saddle. "We need to stop, now. No time." Tayan tried to push him away, but her arms felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive. "Hastian needs medicine. Keep riding. If you fall off your horse at a gallop and crack your skull open, Hastian dies anyway because I don't know where we're going." Kaelin's hands were firm on her waist, lowering her from the saddle with surprising strength for someone smaller than her. "Let me stop the bleeding. 10 minutes. Then we keep moving." Tayan wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but the ground was rushing up to meet her, and darkness was closing in from the edges of her vision. She felt Kaelin ease her down onto the sandy earth, felt him cut away the blood-soaked bandage, felt his hands press against the wound with professional pressure that sent pain lancing through her body and brought clarity back in a sharp, unwelcome rush. "Talk to me," Kaelin said as he worked pulling supplies from his pack. "Stay conscious. Tell me about Hastian. How long has he been sick?" "Weeks." Tayan managed through gritted teeth. He hid it. Didn't want the tribe to worry. Didn't want to seem weak. "Pride is a dangerous thing," says the man who carried his father's guilt for 3 years instead of admitting the truth. Kaelin's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. "Fair point." The pain of him cleaning and rebandaging the wound kept Tayan anchored to consciousness, kept her from drifting into the seductive darkness that promised rest and forgetting. She watched him work in the moonlight, his face set in lines of concentration, and wondered when she had started seeing him as something other than an enemy. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice steadier now that the bleeding had slowed. "About your mistake. Why let your father take the blame?" Kaelin tied off the bandage before answering. "Because I was a coward. Because I was 25 years old and terrified of what it would mean if people knew the truth. Because my father looked at me and said, 'I will carry this. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let one mistake destroy it.'" He sat back on his heels, his face shadowed. "I didn't understand that letting him carry it would destroy him instead. By the time I realized, it was too late. He was already drowning in guilt that should have been mine." "So you've been drowning in it ever since?" "Yes." Tayan pushed herself up to sitting, fighting another wave of dizziness. "That's why you came here. Not just to deliver letters and return an amulet. You came here to die. You wanted my people to kill you because you couldn't do it yourself." "I thought about it," Kaelin admitted, his voice quiet. "Doing it myself. Following my father's path. But that felt like more cowardice. Running away instead of facing consequences. So I decided to face them. To come here. To tell the truth. To let justice be decided by the people I had wronged. And if I had killed you tonight in the healing Hogan when you first told me the truth, then I would have died knowing I had at least done one honest thing before the end." Tayan stared at him. This man who had traveled 30 miles into hostile territory to confess a sin that would almost certainly end in his death, who had spent hours saving her family, knowing it would not absolve him, who sat now in the moonlight with blood on his hands and acceptance in his eyes. "You're an idiot," she said. Kalen blinked surprise crossing his features. Then unexpectedly he laughed. It was a rusty sound like something that had not been used in a long time, but it was genuine. "I've been called worse." "Death doesn't fix things," Tyan continued, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "Death is just an ending. It doesn't balance scales or ease pain or bring back the people we lost." "I know. I've wanted to die every day for 3 years, wanted to follow my brother into whatever comes after, and the only thing that stopped me was knowing it would solve nothing." "Then what does solve it?" Kalen asked, and there was something raw in the question, a desperate need to believe that redemption was possible. "I don't know," Tyan said honestly. "But I think it has something to do with living, with carrying the weight of what we've done and what's been done to us, and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. With saving the people we can save, even when we couldn't save the ones who mattered most." Silence fell between them, but it was different now, charged with understanding instead of hostility. Tyan became aware of how close they were, sitting close enough that she could see the scars on Kalen's hands, old burns and cuts from years of medical work, close enough to see the exhaustion written in every line of his face. "Can you ride?" he asked finally. "Yes." "Then we should keep moving. Hastian doesn't have time for us to sit here having philosophical discussions about death and redemption." Tyan almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she let Kalen help her to her feet, let him boost her back into the saddle, let herself lean on someone else's strength for just a moment before straightening her spine and gathering the reins. They rode on into the night, and somewhere around mile 23, as exhaustion and blood loss began to blur the edges of Tyan's consciousness again, she began to talk. Not because Kalen asked, but because the darkness and the rhythm of the horse's gait and the strange intimacy of shared confession loosened something in her that had been locked tight for 3 years. "I was the one who found him," she said, her voice low enough that Kalen had to ride closer to hear. "Ashki." After the fight with the settlers, he was lying in the canyon bleeding from a dozen wounds trying to crawl home. I carried him all the way to the fort, ran for 3 hours straight with my brother dying in my arms, and all I could think was that if I was just faster, just stronger, I could save him. "Tyan, when your father said he needed to try a blood transfusion, I offered mine. We have the same blood type, but he said I was too weak from carrying Ashki, that I needed to rest. So I waited outside that room while your father and you tried to save him. And I prayed. I prayed to every god I could think of, made every bargain a desperate person makes. Take my strength, take my years, take my life, just let him live." The moonlight caught tears on her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "When your father came out and said Ashki was gone, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there and felt something inside me turn to stone. And I promised myself that I would never be too weak to save someone again. That I would become so strong that nothing could stand against me, that I could protect everyone, that I would never have to watch someone I loved die because I wasn't enough." "You were 22 years old," Kalen said quietly, "barely more than a child yourself, carrying your dying brother for hours. No one that young should have to face that kind of loss. I was old enough to carry my brother, old enough to watch him die, old enough to fail him." "You didn't fail him. He was injured beyond what anyone could survive. Even if every step of his treatment had been perfect, he still might have died. Some wounds are too deep. Some damage can't be undone." "But I didn't know that," Tyan said, and her voice broke on the words. "I thought if I had been stronger, faster, better, he would have lived. So I made myself into someone who was all those things. I trained until my body broke, and then I trained more. I fought anyone who would fight me and beat them all. I became the guardian of my people, the wall that nothing could breach. And I thought that would make the pain stop. Did it? No, it just made me alone." The admission hung in the air between them, stark and terrible in its honesty. Tyan felt something in her chest crack open, 3 years of carefully maintained walls crumbling under the weight of truth spoken aloud. "After my father died," Kalen said into the silence, "I couldn't stay at the fort. couldn't look at the other doctors without seeing disappointment in their eyes. So I left, started traveling, told myself I was bringing medicine to settlements that needed it helping where I could. But really I was just running, moving from place to place so I never had to sit still long enough to feel everything I'd lost. And now I'm tired of running, tired of pretending that moving fast enough will somehow let me outpace my mistakes. Coming here confessing to you it's the first time in 3 years I've stopped long enough to face what I've done. Tyann turned in her saddle to look at him. This man who had murdered her brother through incompetence and good intentions, who had let his father die bearing a guilt that belonged to him, who had ridden into her life with secrets and medicine and a death wish that he had not yet acted on. "What happened to Ashkey?" she said slowly, testing the words as they formed, "was not your fault alone. You made a mistake. Your father made choices. The settlers who stabbed him made choices. The world that puts Navajo people and white settlers at each other's throats made choices. There is enough blame to go around without you carrying all of it." "And you?" Callan asked. "Do you believe that about yourself, that you're not solely responsible for his death?" Tyann wanted to say yes, wanted to absolve herself the way she was trying to absolve him. But the words stuck in her throat, blocked by 3 years of self-recrimination and guilt that had calcified into identity. "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe that's something we figure out together. Two people who couldn't save someone they loved, learning how to forgive themselves by helping each other." The words surprised her as much as they clearly surprised Callan. She had not planned to say them, had not consciously decided to offer anything resembling partnership or understanding. But there they were hanging in the night air like a bridge extended across an impossible chasm. "I would like that," Callan said, and his voice held wonder as if he had not expected to ever hear words like those directed at him again. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different silence, warmer somehow despite the cold desert night. And when Fort Defiance finally appeared on the horizon, a collection of buildings and lights that marked the border between Navajo land and the world that wanted to consume it, Tyann felt something she had not felt since the night her brother died. She felt like she was not carrying her burden alone. The fort gates loomed before them, dark wood and iron that had kept her people out and soldiers in for decades. Tyann pulled her horse to a stop just beyond the reach of the gate lamps, her heart hammering against her ribs. This place. This cursed place where Ashkey had drawn his last breath, where her mother's fate had been sealed years before, where everything good in her life had come to die. "I can't," she breathed, panic rising in her throat like floodwater. "I can't go in there." Callan moved his horse alongside hers close enough that their legs nearly touched. "Yes, you can. Because Hastian needs you to. Because you're the strongest person I've ever met. Not because you can break men in combat, but because you're still here, still fighting, still choosing to live, even when every day is a battle. I'm not strong. I'm just afraid to die." "That's the same thing," Callan said gently. "Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. And right now Hastian needs you to be afraid and move forward anyway." Tyann looked at the gates, then at Callan, then down at her hands gripping the reins hard enough to hurt. She thought about Hastian, who had raised her when her parents died, who had lied to her about her mother's death to protect her from hatred, who had watched her turn herself into a weapon and never once told her she was more than that. She thought about Ashkey, who had died in this place, whose blood still stained her memories. And she thought about the man beside her, who had confessed his worst sin and lived, who had offered her the truth when lies would have been easier, who looked at her like she was a person instead of a legend or a threat. "Together," she said, and it was not a question. "Together," Callan confirmed. The gates of Fort Defiance swung open before them. Tyann's heart hammered as she crossed the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But Callan rode beside her steady and certain, and she found herself matching his pace. Behind them the canyon faded into darkness. Ahead, lamplight spilled across the compound where her mother had died, where her brother had taken his last breath. They had 8 hours to save Hastian's life. The clock was already running. Fort Defiance did not sleep. Even at this hour, deep into the night when honest people should have been dreaming, the fort hummed with activity. Soldiers moved between buildings, their boots striking the hard-packed earth in rhythms that spoke of patrol routes and standing orders. Lanterns burned in windows, casting amber light across the compound where her people had once been imprisoned, where the long walk had begun 2 decades ago, where thousands of Navajo had been forced from their homeland in a march that had killed more than the army would ever admit. Tayen felt every eye turned toward her as she and Kaylin rode through the gates. The weight of their stares pressed against her skin like physical things, some curious, most hostile, all carrying the particular quality of men who viewed her presence as an intrusion, a threat, an insult to the order they had established through force and fear. She held her head high, refusing to show the terror clawing at her throat. Her hand rested on her knife, not as threat, but as comfort, a reminder that she was armed and dangerous even here in the heart of enemy territory. Beside her, Kaylin sat his horse with quiet authority, his former military bearing evident in the set of his shoulders, the way he acknowledged the soldiers with small nods that marked him as one of them, or at least as someone who had been. "Vance," a voice called from the shadows near the headquarters building. An older soldier emerged into the lamplight, his uniform marking him as a sergeant, his face weathered by decades of frontier service. His eyes narrowed when he saw Tayen. "That's Colin Vance, isn't it, Captain Williams' boy? Haven't seen you since your father's funeral. What are you doing here in the middle of the night with a savage?" The slur landed like a slap, but Tayen had been called worse by better men. She said nothing, letting Colin handle the conversation while she studied the fort's layout, marking exits and defensive positions with the tactical awareness of someone who had spent 3 years preparing to protect her people from places exactly like this. "Sergeant Morrison," Kaylin replied, his voice level. "I need access to the fort pharmacy. Medical emergency. A Navajo elder is dying of heart failure. He needs digitalis and he needs it now." Morrison's expression twisted into something between suspicion and disgust. "You rode 30 miles in the middle of the night to save an Indian. I rode 30 miles to save a life, which is what doctors do last I checked. You're not a doctor. You're a medical assistant who got his father killed." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Tayen saw Kaylin flinch, saw the barb strike home, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he dismounted, moving with deliberate calm. "Nevertheless, I need the medicine. Either you help me get it, or you explain to Colonel Brennan in the morning why you let a man die when we had the means to save him." "Colonel Brennan?" Morrison's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing some of the hostility. "She's not going to like being woken up for this." "Then it's fortunate I'm not asking you to wake her. I'm asking you to take me to the pharmacy. I know what I need. 5 minutes and we're gone." Morrison looked from Kaylin to Tayen and back again, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "Fine. But the squaw waits here, under guard. I'm not having her wandering around the fort stealing supplies or gathering intelligence." "Her name is Tayen," Kaylin said quietly, and there was steel beneath the softness of his tone. "And she stays with me. Non-negotiable." "The hell it is. This is a military installation. I don't take orders from civilians, and I sure as hell don't let hostile Indians roam free." "Then consider it a request from the daughter of Black Shawl." The name fell like a thunderclap. Morrison went pale, and Tayen saw recognition and fear war across his features. Around them, the soldiers who had been drifting closer to investigate the commotion stopped, dead hands moving to weapons, not in threat, but in superstitious reflex. Tayen had not spoken the name of her mother in years, had not claimed that legacy, because doing so meant acknowledging a history too painful to touch. But Kaylin had spoken it for her, had wielded it like a weapon or a shield, and she felt something shift in the power dynamics of this confrontation. Black Shawl. Morrison repeated the words barely above a whisper. The woman who killed 3 soldiers barehanded when they tried to stop her from escaping during the long walk. The one who made it 50 miles with a bullet in her back before she finally died. That Black Shawl. My mother, Tyen said, speaking for the first time since entering the fort. Her voice carried across the compound with the force of someone who had spent 3 years learning to project authority through sheer presence. She died here 20 years ago, murdered by men wearing the same uniform you wear now, so forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned with your comfort or your rules. We should leave, Morrison said, backing away. Colonel Brennan needs to handle this. This is above my authority. The medicine, Callan pressed. That's all we came for. Give us the digitalis and we'll be gone before dawn. No one needs to wake the colonel. No one needs to make this complicated. But it was already too late. A door opened across the compound, and a woman emerged, her uniform crisp despite the hour, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She was perhaps 55, with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in rooms full of men who did not want to give it to her. "It's already complicated, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carrying the particular accent of educated New England transplanted to the frontier. "The moment Tyen, daughter of Black Shawl, rode through my gates, it became the most complicated situation this fort has faced in a decade." Colonel Sarah Brennan crossed the compound with unhurried purpose, soldiers parting before her like water before a ship's bow. She stopped 10 feet from where Tyen and Callan stood, her eyes moving between them with an assessment that missed nothing. "Colonel," Callan said, offering a respectful nod, "I apologize for the disturbance. We only need access to the pharmacy. An emergency medical situation." So Sergeant Morrison indicated. Brennan's gaze settled on Tyen, and there was something in that look that was not quite hostility, not quite friendship, but something more complex. "I knew your mother. Not well, but I knew her. She was in the detention camp here for 6 months before she escaped. I was a lieutenant then, young and stupid, and thinking I was serving some noble cause by helping to civilize the savage frontier." Tyen's hand tightened on her knife. "If you're looking for forgiveness for what was done to my people, you won't find it from me." "I'm not looking for forgiveness," Brennan replied. "I'm offering information. Your mother was extraordinary, brave, fierce, protective of the other prisoners, even when it put her at risk. When she escaped, it was because soldiers were planning to separate her from you. You were 5 years old. She fought 3 men to give you time to run, time to be found by your people. She died knowing you were free." The words hit Tyen like stones, each one adding weight to a history she thought she knew but clearly did not. She had spent 20 years believing her mother died of disease, a comfortable lie Hastian had told her to protect her from hatred. Then she had learned fragments of truth, whispers of violence and murder. But this was different. This was someone who had been there, who had witnessed it, who was offering a version of events that made her mother not just a victim, but a hero. "Why are you telling me this?" Tyen asked, her voice rough with emotions she could not name. "Because I think you deserve to know who your mother really was. Not the legend, not the story people tell to frighten soldiers or inspire resistance. The real woman who chose to die so her daughter could live." Brennan turned to Morrison. "Get them the digitalis, and anything else Mr. Vance believes is necessary." "Colonel, with all respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we start giving medicine to Indians, we start saving lives instead of taking them," Brennan interrupted. "Which is what we should have been doing all along. That's an order, Sergeant." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he saluted and stalked toward the pharmacy building, muttering under his breath. Brennan watched him go, then turned back to Tyen and Callan. "Come with me," she said. "We'll talk while the good sergeant retrieves your medicine. I suspect there's more to this story than a simple medical emergency." She led them to a small office in the headquarters building, a Spartan room with a desk, 2 chairs and walls covered in maps of Navajo territory. Tyen studied those maps with growing unease, seeing the notes and markers that indicated patrol routes, water sources, potential areas of Navajo settlement. "Sit," Brennan offered, gesturing to the chairs. When neither Tyen nor Callan moved, she smiled faintly. "Or stand, as you prefer. I'm going to sit, though. It's been a long day, and I suspect it's about to get longer." She settled behind her desk with a sigh, pulling a bottle and 3 glasses from a drawer. "Whiskey. Decent quality. A gift from a grateful settler, whose son I helped evacuate during a cholera outbreak. I don't normally drink on duty, but I think we can make an exception given the circumstances." "We're not here to socialize," Tyan said. "No, you're here to get medicine for Hastian. I know. He and I have met, actually, 3 years ago during peace negotiations that ultimately went nowhere. He's a good man, wise, patient, the kind of leader who understands that survival sometimes requires compromise." Brennan poured 3 glasses, regardless of whether they would be accepted. "I also know why you're really here, Mr. Vance. Or I can guess. You're carrying your father's guilt, and you've come to make some kind of peace with the people he failed." Kalen's expression went carefully neutral, but Tyan saw the tension in his shoulders. "My father spoke of you in his letters. He said you were one of the few officers at Fort Defiance who still believed in honor. Your father was a complicated man, brilliant physician, terrible soldier. He never should have been in the military, but the war needed doctors more than it needed warriors, so they took anyone with medical training and put them in uniform." Brennan sipped her whiskey. "When he failed to save that boy, it broke something in him. Not because he was weak, but because he cared too much. Most of the officers here wouldn't have lost sleep over a dead Indian. Your father couldn't sleep for anything else." "He took his own life," Callan said quietly. 2 years ago. I heard. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I don't think he was a coward. I think he was a man who had seen too much death and couldn't carry the weight of one more." Brennan's eyes shifted to Tyan. "Your brother's death wasn't the first time your father failed to save someone, Mr. Vance, but it was the one he couldn't forgive himself for. Do you know why? Because Ashki was young, innocent, didn't deserve what happened to him." "Because your father had made a promise to Hastian," Brennan corrected. Years before, during those peace negotiations, Hastian had spoken about his grandson. Bright boy, full of life and potential. Your father had promised that if any Navajo came to the fort needing medical care, he would treat them the same as he would treat any soldier. He would not let prejudice or politics interfere with his oath as a physician. When Ashki came in dying and your father couldn't save him, it wasn't just a medical failure. It was a broken promise to someone he respected. Tyan felt the world tilt beneath her feet. All this time she had thought Ashki's death was random tragedy violence colliding with incompetence with fatal results. She had never known about the promise, about the weight of obligation her brother's death had placed on the doctor's shoulders. "There's something else," Brennan continued, and now her voice carried a weight that made Tyan's skin prickle with anticipation. "Something I think you both need to know, though it will complicate everything even further." She stood moving to a cabinet in the corner of the office. From it she withdrew a thick envelope yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had been broken and resealed multiple times. "Your mother," Brennan said to Tyan, "wrote letters during her time in the detention camp, 5 of them. They were addressed to you, meant to be given to you when you were old enough to understand. But after she died, there was confusion. The letters were confiscated as potential intelligence locked away in files that no one bothered to read. I found them 10 years ago while reorganizing old records. I've been holding them, waiting for the right time to return them. I think that time is now." She held out the envelope and Tyan stared at it like it was a snake. Her mother's letters. Words from beyond the grave. From a woman she barely remembered, from a past that had been carefully edited and sanitized by people who thought they were protecting her. "I can't," Tyan whispered. "You can," Callan said beside her, and his hand found hers warm and steady. "Whatever they say, you can face it. You're the strongest person I know." "I'm not strong. I'm terrified." "Same thing." He repeated the words from earlier, and despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion and the weight of 20 years of secrets pressing down on her, Tyan felt something like a smile ghost across her lips. She took the envelope. The paper was soft with age, the ink faded but still legible. She could see her mother's handwriting through the paper loops and curves that spoke of education, of care of a woman who had wanted her daughter to have something more than trauma and loss. "Read them later," Brennan suggested, "when you're somewhere safe, when you have time to process what they contain. Right now, Hastian needs medicine, and you need to leave before my less understanding officers wake up and decide your presence here is grounds for arrest or worse." Morrison appeared in the doorway holding a leather medical bag. His expression suggested he had swallowed something bitter, but he handed the bag to Kalen without comment. Digitalis, enough for a month of treatment if carefully dosed, also morphine bandages, antiseptic, everything you requested. He glared at Tyen. This doesn't change anything. One act of mercy doesn't erase 20 years of bloodshed. No, Tyen agreed. It doesn't, but maybe it's a start. Brennan walked them to the gates, personally ignoring the stares and whispers of soldiers who clearly thought their commanding officer had lost her mind. At the threshold between fort and freedom, she stopped. "Hastian is dying," she said bluntly. "Even with the medicine, his heart is failing. He has weeks, perhaps months if he's fortunate. He knows this. I suspect that's why he allowed this journey to happen. He wanted you to face this place, to begin confronting the past instead of just building walls against it." "How do you know he's dying?" Tyen demanded. "Because he sent me a letter 3 weeks ago, asking me to help you if you ever came here, asking me to tell you about your mother if the opportunity arose, asking me to give you those letters." Brennan's expression softened. "He's been preparing for his death, Tyen, and part of that preparation involves making sure you don't spend the rest of your life alone, consumed by rage and guilt that isn't yours to carry." Tyen wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Hastian was strong, that he would recover, that she could not lose another person she loved. But the words died in her throat because she had seen the truth in Hastian's eyes lately, the acceptance of someone whose time was running out and who had made peace with that fact. "Thank you," Callan said when Tyen could not speak. "For the medicine, for the letters, for treating us with more kindness than we had any right to expect." "Thank your father," Brennan replied. "He and I had many conversations about how to build bridges instead of walls. He didn't live to see it happen, but maybe his son can finish what he started." She looked at Tyen. "And maybe the daughter of Black Shawl can choose a different path than her mother was forced to walk. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because the future deserves a chance." They rode out of Fort Defiance as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Tyen carried the medicine that might save Hastian's life and the letters that would certainly change hers. Callan rode beside her in silence, giving her space to process, to feel, to exist, without having to explain or justify or defend. It was only when they were an hour out, the fort disappeared behind them and the canyon rising ahead, that Tyen spoke. "My mother wrote me letters." "Yes." "Hastian knew about them, knew where they were, knew I could have had them years ago." "Yes." "He kept them from me. Another secret. Another lie wrapped in good intentions." "Maybe," Callan said carefully. "Or maybe he was waiting until you were ready to hear what they had to say, until you had someone beside you who could help you carry the weight of whatever truth they contain." Tyen pulled her horse to a stop, looking at this man who had become something more than enemy or ally over the course of one impossible night. This man who had confessed his worst sin and lived. This man who looked at her and saw a person instead of a weapon or a legend or a problem to be solved. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Helping me, riding beside me, acting like we're partners instead of two people brought together by tragedy and circumstance." "Because I'm tired of carrying my burdens alone. Because you're the first person in 3 years who hasn't looked at me with pity or disgust or disappointment. Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to have a purpose beyond just surviving until the next day." He met her eyes steadily. "Because I think we could help each other become something more than just our worst moments." Tyen felt tears building behind her eyes again, hot and unwelcome. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to be anything except strong and alone." "Then maybe we learn together. Two people who thought they had to carry everything themselves, figuring out what it means to share the weight." The words settled between them like a promise, fragile and frightening and full of possibility. Tyen thought about the letters in her saddlebag, about Hastian dying in his hogan, about her brother buried 3 years and her mother dead 20. She thought about all the weight she had been carrying, all the armor she had built, all the walls she had erected to protect a heart that had been broken so many times it barely remembered what whole felt like. and she thought about the man beside her who had carried his own weights, built his own walls, and who was offering to stand with her while they both learned how to take those walls down. "Together," she said, testing the word, finding it strange and terrifying and somehow exactly right. "Together," Kalen confirmed. Dawn painted the desert in copper and gold as they rode toward home. Fort Defiance vanished behind them, but Tyann carried more than medicine in her saddlebag now. Her mother's letters, her mother's voice reaching across 20 years of silence. Kalen rode beside her without speaking, giving her space to process, to feel, to begin the slow work of healing. Ahead, the canyon waited, and Hastian, and a choice about what kind of guardian she wanted to be. They reached the canyon as morning light turned the stone walls to gold. Tyann pushed her horse harder than she should have, driven by a fear that had nothing to do with enemies or violence, and everything to do with the terrible possibility that they would arrive too late, that Hastian would already be gone, that she would spend the rest of her life knowing she had been just hours too slow to save the last person who truly knew her. The camp materialized from the canyon shadows like something conjured from memory and hope. Smoke rose from morning fires. Children who should have been playing stood quiet and watchful. Adults emerged from hogans with faces that told her everything she needed to know about how bad things had become in the hours she had been gone. Niol met them at the edge of camp, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "He's still breathing. Barely. We've been taking turns sitting with him, talking to him, trying to keep him here. But Tyann, I don't know how much longer he can hold on." She dismounted before her horse fully stopped stumbling slightly as her injured side screamed protest. Kalen caught her elbow, steadying her, and she saw Niol's eyes widen at the casual intimacy of the gesture, at the way she accepted help instead of rejecting it. "The medicine," she said, taking the leather bag from Kalen. "How do we administer it?" "Carefully," Kalen replied, falling into step beside her as they hurried toward Hastian's hogan. "Digitalis is powerful. Too much will kill him as surely as too little will fail to save him. I'll need to examine him first, assess his heart rate, and breathing calculate the correct dosage based on his weight and condition." They entered the hogan to find Hastian lying on his sleeping mat, his breathing shallow and irregular, his lips tinged with the blue that meant his heart was failing to push enough blood through his body. His eyes were closed, but when Tyann knelt beside him they opened, focusing on her with difficulty. "You came back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was afraid you wouldn't. Afraid the fort would keep you one way or another." "Nothing could keep me from you," Tyann said, and was surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "You're not allowed to die, old man. Not yet. Not when I still need you. Everyone dies, child. Even stubborn old fools who should have said certain truths long before now." His gaze shifted to Kalen, who had moved to his other side and was already checking his pulse, listening to his heartbeat with the focused attention of a trained medical practitioner. "And who is this? The son, I think? I see William's eyes in your face." "Yes, sir," Kalen replied, not pausing in his examination. "My name is Kalen Vance. I've come to help if you'll allow it." "Help?" Hastian's laugh was more wheeze than sound. "William's son comes to help after William's mistake killed my grandson. There's irony in that, or karma, or simply the universe's sense of dark humor." "It wasn't his father's mistake," Tyann said before she could stop herself. "It was his. Callan made the error during Ashki's treatment. His father took the blame to protect him." Hastian's eyes clouded with pain and medication sharpened with surprise. "Is this true?" "Yes," Kalen said simply. "And I've come to confess it, to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate. But first, please let me try to save your life. You can pass judgment on me after you're well enough to do so with a clear mind." "Judgment." Hastian closed his eyes. "I'm too tired for judgment. Too old. Too close to whatever comes next to care about assigning blame for what happened years ago." He coughed, a wet sound that made Tyann's heart clench. "Give me the medicine. Save me or don't. Either way, there are things I need to say before I run out of time to say them." Kalen worked with swift efficiency, measuring doses with the precision of someone who understood that medicine was as much art as science, that the difference between healing and harming could be measured in drops. He administered the digitalis orally, then sat back to wait while the medicine took effect. "It will take time," he explained to Tyen. "Hours before we know if it's working. Days before he's stable enough to be out of danger. But his heart is still strong despite the failure. If the medicine takes hold, he could have months, maybe more." "Months," Hastian repeated. "Long enough, perhaps. Long enough for what needs to happen." He gestured weakly for Tyen to come closer. "There are letters, in the wooden box beneath my sleeping mat. Bring them to me." Tyen retrieved the box with hands that shook despite her best efforts to remain calm. Inside were papers, old and yellowed, some in English, and some in Navajo, records of a life lived between worlds. Hastian pointed to a specific bundle tied with leather cord. "Those, from William. He sent them over the years, after Ashki died, trying to explain, trying to apologize, trying to find some way to make peace with what had happened." Hastian's breathing eased slightly as the medicine began to work, color returning to his lips in increments. "I never answered them. Couldn't bring myself to offer forgiveness when my grief was still too raw. But I kept them, read them, let his words work on me like water on stone." He looked at Kaelin with eyes that held understanding and sorrow in equal measure. "Your father was a good man who made a terrible mistake in training you. He gave you responsibility you weren't ready for, then compounded that error by taking your blame as his own. He thought he was protecting you. Instead, he taught you that truth was negotiable, that love meant bearing another's burden even when doing so crushed you beneath its weight." "I know," Kaelin said quietly. "I've spent 3 years understanding that. 3 years wishing I could go back and refuse his protection, insist on facing my own consequences. And if you had, what then? You would have been court-martialed, discharged in disgrace, perhaps imprisoned. Your life destroyed before it truly began. Your father saw that future and chose differently, not wisely, but with love." Hastian coughed again, less severe this time. "The question is whether you've learned from his mistake or are doomed to repeat it. I don't understand. You came here to die, to confess and be punished and finally escape the guilt that's been eating you alive. That's just another form of running away, boy. Another way of letting fear make your decisions." Hastian's hand, weathered and spotted with age, reached out to grasp Kaelin's wrist with surprising strength. "Real courage isn't dying for your mistakes. It's living with them, carrying them, using them to become someone better than the person who made them in the first place." Tyen watched this exchange with something tightening in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name, but that felt dangerously close to hope. She had spent 3 years believing that strength meant never breaking, that survival meant never showing weakness, that protection required walls so high nothing could scale them. But here was Hastian dying, and somehow more alive than she had felt in years, teaching lessons she had been too armored to hear. "There's more," Hastian said, turning his attention back to Tyen. "Things I should have told you years ago but didn't because I was afraid. Afraid of what the truth would do to you. Afraid that knowing would break you in ways that losing your brother and your parents couldn't." What things, Tyen asked, though part of her didn't want to know, wanted to keep living in the comfortable half-truths that had shaped her understanding of her own history. "Your mother. Black shawl. You know she died escaping from Fort Defiance. You know she fought soldiers to give you time to run, but you don't know why she was escaping that day specifically." Hastian paused, gathering strength, and Kaelin quietly administered water, helping the old man drink with a gentleness that made Tyen's throat tight. "There was a policy," Hastian continued, "unofficial but widely practiced. Children of detained Navajo were to be separated from their parents, sent to schools far away, where they would be taught to forget their language, their culture, their people. Your mother heard rumors that this was about to happen to you. She couldn't bear it, couldn't stand the thought of losing you to a world that would erase everything that made you Navajo. So she decided to escape, to take you and run even though she knew it was suicide. You told me she died of disease," Tyen said, her voice hollow. "You let me believe that for 15 years. I told you a lie wrapped in mercy. You were 10 years old when you finally asked about your mother's death. 10 years old and already carrying so much grief for your father who had died just months before. I thought giving you the truth would add a burden you couldn't carry. That hatred for the soldiers who killed her would consume you." Hastian's eyes were wet now, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I was wrong. Lies don't protect people. They just delay the pain while making it worse." "The colonel at the fort," Callan interjected quietly. "Colonel Brennan. She gave Tyan letters. From her mother. Written before she died." Hastian's expression shifted surprise, and something like relief crossing his features. "Sarah kept them. Good. I asked her to, years ago asked her to hold them until the right time. I thought perhaps I would know when that time came. Instead, the universe decided for me." "You knew Colonel Brennan." Tyan felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, every certainty she had built her life upon revealing itself as sand rather than stone. "We corresponded for years after your mother's death. She was horrified by what happened. Tried to bring charges against the soldiers responsible, but the army protected its own. She couldn't get justice for Blackshaw, so she tried to get truth instead. Those letters are that truth. Your mother's words. Her love for you. Her hopes for who you would become." Hastian's hand found Tyan's gripping with the last of his strength. "And when you read them, you'll learn that your mother didn't want you to become a weapon. She wanted you to become water. Strong enough to carve canyons, gentle enough to give life. She wanted you to remember that our people survived not just through fighting, but through adapting, flowing, finding new paths when old ones were blocked." "I don't know how to be water," Tyan whispered. "I only know how to be stone." "Then perhaps it's time to learn," Hastian said, his gaze moving between Tyan and Kalen. "Both of you. Two people who turned themselves to stone to survive grief. Two people who thought hardness was the same as strength. Maybe together you can remember that real strength flows." Silence settled over the Hogan, broken only by the sound of Hastian's breathing, steadier now as the medicine worked its slow magic. Outside, the camp was beginning to stir with normal morning activity, children's laughter mixing with adult conversation, the sounds of a community going about the business of living despite death's constant shadow. "William sent me one final letter," Hastian said after a long moment. "Before he died. It wasn't an apology. We were past that by then. It was a prediction. He said that someday his son would meet my granddaughter, and that when they did, they would either destroy each other or save each other. He wasn't sure which. He only knew that their meeting was inevitable, that grief and guilt would draw them together like planets to a sun." "And which do you think it will be?" Callan asked. "Destruction or salvation?" Hastian smiled, tired but genuine. "I think that's up to you. Both of you. You can choose to let your shared pain become a weapon you turn on each other. Or you can choose to let it become a bridge, a way of understanding that you're not alone in carrying burdens too heavy for one person." He closed his eyes, exhaustion finally claiming him. "Now leave me. Let me sleep. And when I wake, perhaps we can all begin again. No more lies, no more secrets, just truth, however painful, and the work of building something better from the ruins of what was." Tyan and Kalen left the Hogan together, stepping into morning sunlight that seemed too bright after the dimness inside. They stood for a moment in silence, both processing everything they had heard, everything that had changed in the hours since they had ridden toward Fort Defiance, with nothing but desperate hope and medicine. "He's going to live," Callan said finally. "The medicine is working. His heart is stabilizing. He'll be weak for weeks, but he'll live." "To finish dying later," Tyan replied, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. "He's right, though, about everything. I've been stoned for so long I forgot what it felt like to be anything else." She pulled the envelope from her saddlebag, the letters from her mother that she had been too afraid to open during the ride back. The paper was warm from being pressed against the horse's side, soft with age and handling. "Will you stay?" she asked Kalen, surprising herself with the question. "While I read them, I don't think I can do this alone." "I'll stay as long as you need me to," Callan said, and the simple certainty in his voice made something in Tyen's chest ease. They found a quiet place at the canyon's edge where morning light painted the stone walls in shades of amber and rose. Tyen sat with her back against sun-warmed rock, and Kalen sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched far enough that she didn't feel crowded. She opened the first letter with trembling hands and began to read her mother's words written 20 years ago by a woman who knew she was going to die, but wanted her daughter to live. The words swam before her eyes, blurred by tears she finally allowed herself to shed. Tears for her mother, for her brother, for all the years she had spent being strong when what she needed was permission to be soft. And beside her, Kalen sat in silence, his presence a steady anchor proving that sometimes the greatest strength was simply being there, while someone else broke open and began finally to heal. The first letter trembled in Tyen's hands. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each word formed with the precision of someone who knew these might be the last words her daughter would ever receive from her. Tyen could picture her mother bent over stolen paper in the detention camp, using whatever implement she could find, carving out love and wisdom in ink that had faded but not disappeared. "My daughter," the letter began, and Tyen had to stop, had to breathe through the wave of grief that crashed over her at those two simple words. "If you are reading this, I am gone. I write these words knowing I will not see you grow into the woman you are meant to become. But I can imagine her. Strong, yes. Our people need strength, but also gentle, also wise, also capable of joy in a world that will try very hard to teach you only sorrow." Kalen shifted slightly beside her, not speaking, not intruding, just present in a way that made it possible for Tyen to keep reading when every instinct screamed at her to stop, to put the letters away, to return to the comfortable numbness she had cultivated for 3 years. "I know what they will tell you about how I died," her mother's words continued. "They will make it sound noble, a warrior's death, a sacrifice worth celebrating. And perhaps it was. But I want you to know the truth beneath the legend. I was terrified. I did not want to die. I wanted to live to see you grow, to teach you our language, to show you how to weave and ride and navigate this world that belongs to us even as others try to take it away." Tyen's vision blurred. She wiped at her eyes impatiently, angry at the tears, angry at the grief, angry at everything except the man sitting beside her who made no comment about her weakness, who simply existed in the space next to her pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or turn it into something more palatable. "But wanting something and being able to have it are different things," the letter went on. "They were going to take you from me, send you away to one of their schools where they would cut your hair and forbid your language and punish you for being what you are. I could not allow that. So I chose. I chose to fight so you could run. I chose to die so you could remain free. And I would choose it again every time because you are worth more than my life. You are the future our people need." The words blurred together as Tyen read through the first letter, then the second, then the third. Each one added layers to a portrait of a woman she had barely known, a woman who had been more than just the legend of Black Shawl, more than just the fierce warrior who killed 3 soldiers with her bare hands. She had been human, afraid, loving, imperfect, real. The fourth letter was different, shorter, more urgent. "There is something you must understand, my daughter. Strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is not standing alone against the world. Strength is knowing when to bend so you do not break. It is knowing when to accept help instead of insisting you can carry everything yourself. It is choosing life over pride, healing over revenge, love over hate." Tyen looked up from the page, staring out at the canyon that had been her refuge and her prison for 3 years. She thought about all the men she had beaten, all the battles she had won, all the time she had proven beyond doubt that she was stronger than anyone who challenged her. And she thought about how empty those victories had been, how they had left her increasingly isolated, increasingly alone, increasingly convinced that strength meant never needing anyone. "Your grandmother used to tell me a story," the letter continued, and Tyen realized with a jolt that her mother was writing about the same grandmother who had raised her, the healer who had died when Tyen was 12, whose loss had been the first in a series of losses that had shaped her into the person she had become. She said that water is the strongest thing in the world because it can carve canyons from solid stone. But it does this not through hardness but through persistence, not through refusing to bend, but through finding every crack, every weakness, every opportunity to flow. "She sounds wise," Callan said quietly, the first words he had spoken in an hour. "She was," Tyan replied, her voice rough. "But I didn't understand what she was trying to teach me. I thought strength meant being hard enough that nothing could break me. I didn't realize I was just making myself brittle." She picked up the fifth and final letter. This one was dated the day before her mother died, written with a hand that shook slightly, words that carried the weight of someone who knew time was running out. "Tomorrow I will attempt to escape. I know the risks. I know I will likely die. But I also know that if I do nothing, I lose you anyway slowly, as they strip away everything that makes you who you are. So I will choose the quick death over the slow one. I will choose action over surrender." Tayan's breath caught. This was it. The last words her mother had written, the final message across 20 years of silence and secrets. "But I want you to understand something that took me too long to learn. Fighting is sometimes necessary. Sometimes it is the only choice left to people who have been given no other options. But fighting should never be your first choice, your only identity, your reason for existing. We fight to protect what we love. We fight to preserve our people and our culture and our right to exist in this world. But we do not fight just to prove we can. We do not turn ourselves into weapons and forget we are also human." The words hit like hammer blows, each one striking at the foundation of the identity Tyan had built over 3 years of proving her strength, of becoming the guardian who never bent, who never showed weakness, who never let anyone close enough to see the frightened girl beneath the warrior's exterior. "When this is over, when I am gone, you will want to be angry. You will want to hate. You will want to make yourself so strong that no one can ever hurt you again. And I understand that impulse, my daughter. I have felt it myself. But I am begging you, across whatever distance separates us, do not let anger become your only emotion. Do not let strength become your only identity. Do not let the people who hurt us turn you into something as hard and cold and lifeless as the stone walls that imprisoned us." Tyan felt something break inside her chest, a crack spreading through armor she had been building for years, for her entire life, if she was honest. The grief that poured through that crack was overwhelming, a flood of everything she had been holding back, all the tears she had refused to cry, all the pain she had converted into rage and training and endless, exhausting vigilance. "I can't," she gasped, the letters falling from her hands as she doubled over, arms wrapped around her middle, as if she could physically hold herself together. I can't. "You can," Callan said, and then his arms were around her, not restraining, not controlling, just holding her while she shattered. "You're doing it right now, being brave enough to break, being strong enough to feel everything you've been running from." She cried in a way she had not cried since she was a child, great wrenching sobs that tore through her body like storms, leaving her gasping and shaking, and more vulnerable than she had ever allowed herself to be in the presence of another human being. She cried for her mother, dead 20 years defending her freedom. She cried for her father, dead of disease she had been too young to understand. She cried for Ashki, bleeding out in a fort while doctors tried and failed to save him. She cried for Hastian, dying slowly in his hogan despite the medicine they had brought. She cried for the girl she had been before loss taught her that love meant pain, and she cried for the woman she had become, so armored against hurt that she had forgotten how to feel anything else. And through it all, Callan held her. He did not try to quiet her tears or tell her everything would be all right or offer empty platitudes about time and healing. He simply provided an anchor, a steady presence that said without words that she did not have to go through this alone. That breaking did not mean weakness, that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was let someone else help carry the weight. When the storm finally passed, leaving her empty and exhausted and somehow lighter, Tyan pulled back slightly, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "I'm sorry. Don't be. I just fell apart on you like some weak. You're the least weak person I've ever met." Kalen interrupted. "What you just did, letting yourself feel all of that took more courage than any fight you've ever won." Tayan really looked at him for the first time since they had met. She saw the exhaustion written in every line of his face, the grief he carried that matched her own, the guilt that had driven him to ride into enemy territory, knowing he might not leave alive. She saw someone who understood what it meant to live with unbearable weight, who had made his own mistakes and paid his own prices, who was just as broken and just as strong as she was. "Read the last page," Kalen said, gently picking up the final letter and placing it back in her hands. "There's more." Tayan unfolded the paper with shaking fingers and found a final paragraph written in handwriting that was barely legible, as if her mother had been writing in darkness or in a hurry or both. "One last thing, my daughter. When you meet someone who sees past your walls, who looks at you and sees a person instead of a weapon, do not push them away. Do not tell yourself that you are too strong to need anyone, that accepting help is weakness, that love is a liability you cannot afford. Open your hand. Let them in. Because the greatest tragedy would not be dying young like I did. It would be living a long life and dying alone, surrounded by walls you built to protect a heart that never learned to truly live." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of words written 20 years ago that felt like they had been written specifically for this moment, for this person sitting beside her, for this impossible situation where the son of her brother's killer had become the first person in 3 years to see her as something other than the guardian who never broke. "She would have liked you," Tayan said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "You think so? She wanted me to be water. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like maybe I could be, like maybe being soft sometimes doesn't make me weak." She turned to face him fully. Why do you look at me and see a person when everyone else sees a wall or a weapon or a problem to be managed?" Kalen was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I know what it's like to hide behind walls, to turn yourself into something hard and distant, because feeling everything is too painful. And I know that the person behind those walls is usually the one most in need of being seen." He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and touched her face with gentle fingers, wiping away the tracks of tears. "Also because when I look at you, I don't see someone who needs to be stronger. I see someone who's been strong for so long that she's forgotten she's allowed to rest sometimes. And I think maybe I could be someone she rests with, if she'd let me. I don't know how to do that. How to rest. How to let someone in. Neither do I. But maybe we could figure it out together." The word hung between them again, that word that had become a talisman over the course of one impossible night. Together. Not alone, not carrying separate burdens in isolated fortresses, but side by side, sharing weight, learning to be water instead of stone. "The settlement," Tayan said, remembering suddenly. "The sick children you mentioned, was that real or just an excuse to come here?" "It's real. There's a fever outbreak in a settlement about 40 miles northwest. Children dying. They need medicine and someone who knows how to treat epidemic diseases." He paused. "But I wasn't going to go. I was going to come here, confess to Hastian, and accept whatever justice he decided. The settlement was just the story I told myself to justify the journey. And now Hastian is stable. The medicine worked. He'll live weeks or months, which is more than he had yesterday, and those children are still dying." Kalen's expression was uncertain, hopeful, afraid. "I thought maybe I could go to them, try to help. And I thought maybe you could come with me. Not because I need protection or because I can't do it alone, but because I don't want to be alone anymore. Because working beside you last night, saving Tawa and Nyalnish, it reminded me what it feels like to have a purpose beyond just running from my past." Tayan thought about her role as guardian, about the canyon passage she defended, about the reputation she had built as the woman no man could match. Leaving even temporarily meant abandoning that post, that identity, that carefully constructed wall between her people and the world that threatened them. But it also meant choosing to be water instead of stone, to flow towards something instead of just standing rigid against everything, to open her hand instead of keeping it perpetually curled into a fist. "I'll need to speak with the tribe," she said slowly. "Make sure someone can watch the passage while I'm gone. Make sure Hastian has people to care for him." "So, that's yes." "That's yes, on one condition." "Which is?" "When this is over, when those children are saved or beyond saving, you don't just ride off to the next crisis. You stay. Not forever, not as a prisoner, but as someone who belongs here, who has earned a place among my people through actions instead of heritage." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm tired of being alone, and I think you are too. So let's stop running, both of us. Let's choose somewhere to stand still and see what we can build when we're not constantly fleeing our own histories." Kalen's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, bright and warm and full of promise. "I would like that very much." They stood together at the canyon's edge as morning deepened into day, two people who had been brought together by tragedy and guilt, but who were choosing against all odds and expectations to build something new from the ruins of what had been. Below them the camp stirred with life. Above them the sky stretched endlessly blue, and between them the space that had been filled with hostility and suspicion was slowly transforming into something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, impossibly like healing, unexpectedly like the beginning of a story that neither had imagined possible when they first met. "We should tell them," Tyen said. "The tribe, about the settlement, about us going together. They won't like it." "No, but they'll accept it, because Hastian will support the decision, because I'm still their guardian, even if I'm choosing to guard them differently than I have been." She turned from the canyon to face Kalen fully, and because sometimes the best way to protect people is to show them that enemies can become allies, that healing is possible, that we don't have to be defined by our worst moments forever. They walked back to camp together, and Tyen felt eyes tracking their movement, saw the questions forming in the faces of her people. Tomorrow there would be explanations to give, plans to make, supplies to gather for the journey ahead. Tomorrow there would be challenges and resistance, and the hard work of convincing people that change was necessary, that growth was possible, that the daughter of Black Shawl could choose a different path than her mother had been forced to walk. But today, right now, in this moment, suspended between past and future, Tyen allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 3 years. Peace. Not the peace of endings, but the peace of beginnings. The peace of choosing to open her hand instead of keeping it clenched. The peace of accepting that strength could look like vulnerability, that power could look like partnership, that the truest courage was not in standing alone against the world, but in choosing to stand beside someone who saw you, truly saw you, and decided you were worth standing beside in return. The sun climbed higher over the canyon, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility, and Tyen walked toward her future with her head high and her heart, for the first time in years, cautiously beginning to open. 3 days later, Tyen stood before the assembled tribe with Kalen beside her. Hastian sat propped against cushions, still weak but alive, his color returned. Niol had gathered the people, and now they watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion as Tyen explained her decision. "I am still your guardian," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered faces. "But I have learned something these past days. Protecting you does not mean standing alone. It does not mean turning myself into stone. Our enemies become our allies when we choose healing over hatred." She gestured to Kalen. "This man's father failed to save Ashki. He himself made the mistake that cost my brother his life. By all rights I should have killed him, but he has also saved Tawa and Naalnish. He has ridden into enemy territory beside me. He has proven that people can be more than their worst moments." Silence. Then Hastian's voice, still weak but carrying authority. "Black Shawl Tyen's mother wrote letters before she died. I have carried them for 20 years, waiting for the right time. In her final words, she told her daughter to be water, not stone, to flow, not break, to open her hand when someone worthy appeared." He looked at Kalen, then back to Tyen. "I believe that time has come." Niol stepped forward. "And the settlement? The sick children?" "We leave at first light," Tyen said. I ask that someone watch the canyon passage while I am gone. When I return, I will still be your guardian, but perhaps a different kind, one who builds bridges instead of walls." The tribe murmured, debated, argued, but in the end they agreed. That night, Tyen stood at the canyon's edge one final time before the journey. Kalen found her there, 2 horses already saddled for the morning departure. "Afraid?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "I've spent 3 years knowing exactly who I was. Now I'm choosing to become someone different, someone softer. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff." "Then it's fortunate you won't be jumping alone." She looked at him, this man who had ridden into her life carrying guilt and medicine and the possibility of something she had thought lost forever. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. The seed of something that could grow if they both had the courage to tend it. "My mother's last words," Tyen said softly, "were about opening my hand, about letting someone in." She extended her hand toward him, palm up, vulnerable. Kalen took it without hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. Not the guardian, not the weapon, not the legend. Just me." They stood there as the stars emerged, 2 people who had been brought together by death and guilt, but who were choosing against all odds to build something new. Tomorrow they would ride toward a settlement full of sick children. Tomorrow they would test whether healing was truly possible. But tonight, in this moment, Tyen allowed herself to simply be held, to rest, to believe that maybe, just maybe, strength could look like softness. That water was stronger than stone. That opening your hand didn't make you weak. It made you human. And being human, she was finally learning, was the greatest strength of all. The end.